After all our hard work this winter, the time had finally come. The mast step, the floor, the hatch, the breakwater and patching the deck, the new water tank, charger and autopilot, a new propeller, a lot of coats of paint and varnish, new steering cables, idler pulleys, a spinnaker sock, hours of research and planning, lots of dollars, and buckets of sweat equity.
Sweat equity? It was cold.
And, well, yeah, it was cold, but you know what I mean. We were finally as ready as we could be. The crane was scheduled and the launch date was set, and this was all the footage I was able to take. But with the mast stepped, the yard dropped us in the water and we were able to drive Bombadil over to our slip. We launched on a Tuesday and had planned to move in that weekend, so we had a few days to finish some things up. And by finish some things up, I mean start a big, last-minute, and kind of unexpected project. We've never had a freezer on board Bombadil, and we didn't have one on our first boat, Kalamazoo, either, and it had finally gotten to us. I cannot wait to be able to buy some extra food at the grocery store, stick it in here, and be able to save it for longer than a couple of days, and Philip is ecstatic to be able to have a carton of ice cream on board. Before, we'd have to get those little pint size, and they're not supposed to be single serve, but we definitely use them as single serve, because if you didn't eat the whole thing, you had to throw it away. I think that getting a freezer on board is just going to be an absolute game changer. The only downside is that, as with most additions like this, I lost some prime real estate for storage. Behind the starboard settee is where we'd had the bladder for last year's temporary water tank, and with the installation of the new water tank under the floor, we didn't need it anymore. So losing the space behind the settee wasn't going to impact the storage situation very much because I'd never used it, but losing this shelf area was really going to cut down on where I've stored most of our snacks and dry goods. But there was a solution to that too, and after Philip's done putting the freezer in, I'll show you a real-time update on where my non-perishables live.
So it's kind of in its final position. Yes, it's held up by a piece of paracord, and it's very dusty. But that's roughly where it's going to go, and then I got to make it all look pretty. So I just have to figure out how I'm going to fix it in its current location. And actually, I would like it to go down probably ½ inch, almost an inch, somewhere around between those. And that'll give me space to mount the compressor down below. Yeah, so I need to figure out how I'm gonna attach this in, which is a little bit of a brain teaser. So this is my lid for my new freezer. I believe it's all mahogany. So I just sanded the top surface. I did sand the underside. I designed it to take a ½ inch piece of foam inside. It's about a 1 inch tall frame. So then this is the foam. It's just cheap foam board, but it'll just help insulate the top a little bit because the top had like a quarter of the insulation that the rest of the, I think probably half. It was probably ½ inch of foam on the lid, and so this will add a little bit more to the lid insulation, but it'll also, this increases the weight. And the freezer I bought, the lid's really light, and so people said it was struggling to seal. So by adding a little bit of wood to weight it down, it should help the lid seal. So I'm gonna just sand the foam and get it all scuffed up, and then I'll glue it in with some thickened epoxy.
Once the foam was secured to the wood, it then had to be secured to the lid, so more thickened epoxy was used. Beyond a careful application of the epoxy to make sure it would fully adhere, Philip employed a few tricks like the CPR warm-up, the corner double check, and whatever this is. But as Philip would say with a bit of a smirk, trust me, I'm an engineer. After a couple coats of varnish on a hot day, it was ready to use. Oh, and if you're concerned about this bag of what looks to be groceries and a dozen eggs slowly warming up in the sunshine, don't stress. None of it needed refrigeration, and the eggs were farm fresh and unwashed. They really do taste much better than the store-bought ones, and they can live on the counter instead of taking up my precious refrigerator space. Now, this is probably not how the freezer will stay mounted, but it works for now. For the extra storage space that we lost with our freezer, we have these beautiful hatches all down the floor, and so our solution for that was these nice little latches here. You can just pick these guys up, set it off to the side, and ta-da! Got cans of food here, 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 and we could go further back if we wanted to, but I do make sure that I only put stuff down here that's going to be in like a plastic container or a can. I don't take labels off of stuff yet just because for the most part it's not going to be in here for super long. We don't keep tons of food on the boat at the moment. But yeah, if it's got a plastic can or a glass container, all of those can live down here. So, well, this one's not so much food at the moment. It's mostly beer.
I recently purchased this gauge, and it's for tensioning shrouds. So you put the shrouds and stays, I guess. It goes through here, and then it hooks into this spring-loaded clip, and then there's a scale over here, and then the scale comes out, and that gives you a estimation or it says plus or minus 3%. So it gives you a percentage of the breaking strength of the cable of how tight it is based on how much the cable can bend. So I just used it and tightened our shrouds and backstay. The backstay, I think I was pretty close already, but because it still has a hydraulic gauge, and that one, I just know what to look for on the pressure of the gauge. But for the shrouds, I wasn't sure how tight they need to be, so I now tensioned them. I don't think our shrouds were actually fully tight last year. They seem a little bit tighter this year. But yeah, other than we don't have sails on the boat, I think we're pretty close to being ready to go sailing, which is exciting. So, though we're also trying to move in, but I'm excited that this part is marked off the list, as it was a concern, especially since we had some rough weather the last couple days, and I just kind of hand tightened them and hoped for the best. So, but now that they're fully tight, we shouldn't have any issues. So in preparation for tuning the mast, I listened to a few podcasts. I also did a bunch of research. The first step is to get it centered over top of the boat. So hoisting a tape measure all the way up to the top of the mast. Normally it's on a slug or car. And this allows you to then measure to each shroud or chain plate on the deck from either side. And the goal is that the measurement is the same, and you just keep working the turnbuckles till each side measures the same, and therefore the mast is then centered over top of the deck. Otherwise you're going to have weird performance issues if it's not. Then you set the rake of the mast, so the fore aft direction of the mast head. And on our boat, our mast was almost completely vertical last year. That was by a user error in installing the forestay, and so actually when we did the mast step, it actually went down just a fuzz, and that allowed the mast to have a better aft rake in it. So we weren't too concerned with that. So once it's centered over the boat, we then worked on tensioning the shrouds, and so you start from top to bottom, and then front to back is typically how you do it. So your cap shrouds are first, and those go all the way to the top, and then your intermediaries, and then forward lowers and after lowers. And you take even turns off both sides of the turnbuckles, so you don't just tension to one side and then have to tension the other, because that pulls the masthead out of alignment. So you do a quarter turn on one side, you do a quarter turn on the other, and you just keep working until the gauge reads the approximate tension. Once all the shrouds and stays are tension to either feel or the gauge. Then the next step is to actually take the boat sailing. Normally you want 10 to 15 knots of wind, and you go full main and full 100% head sail, start sailing upwind, and you check to see how loose the leeward shrouds are. And from the research I did, if you can move the pin at the bottom of the shroud, it's too loose. If you can't move the pin with your fingers, it's about the right amount of tension. And so if it's too loose on either side, you take identical turns out of both sides. The whole time you're also sighting up the mast to make sure it's all in column and there's not like a S or a bend. So it's a little bit finicky and repetitive process, but all in all, it was a lot easier than I thought it was going to be.
Phillip had to climb the mast to straighten out our spinnaker halyards, and he took the opportunity to lubricate some various parts in the rig. With that done, we finished some pretty boring things, like moving, and then we finally got out for a short sail. Again, we forgot to remember to film, but I got a few snippets on my phone. Next week we'll tackle a few more projects, and then finally get out for a real sail.